Let's dive right into one of the absolute most critical landmark cases in international trade law, the WTO dispute over the U.S. Clean Air Act. If you are prepping for your trade law exam, especially if you're studying the massive friction between global trade rules and domestic environmental regulations, the WTO panel report on U.S. gasoline is an absolute must-know. We are meticulously unpacking every single legal intricacy today, so grab your notes and let's get into it.
To give you the ultimate study guide, we are going to strictly follow the IRAC method across 5 areas. First, the factual background. Second, the core issue of baselines. Third, the national treatment principle under Article 3. Fourth, the Article XX exceptions. And finally, the verdict. First, let's quickly get the procedural history down so you have the chronological context of how Venezuela and Brazil actually challenged the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. In January of 1995, Venezuela requested consultations under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which you know as GATT. By April, a WTO panel was established. Then Brazil requested to join the dispute in May. Because both countries were challenging the exact same EPA rule, the dispute settlement body just combined the matters into one. By January 1996, the final panel report was issued, and it set a massive, really foundational precedent for international trade.
Section 1. The factual background. The Clean Air Act and the EPA's gasoline rule.
Okay, so this whole dispute stems from the U.S. Congress's 1990 amendment to the Clean Air Act, which was aimed at curbing vehicle emissions. The U.S. wanted to control air pollution, specifically toxic air pollutants and ozone-forming volatile organic compounds, by strictly regulating the composition of gasoline sold by refiners, blenders, and importers. To do this, the EPA divided the market into 2 distinct types of gasoline, and each required producers to meet specific non-degradation emission standards compared to the baseline year of 1990. The first type was reformulated gasoline. This was mandatory in the 9 worst ozone non-attainment areas, which made up about 30% of the U.S. market. The second type, conventional gasoline, was sold in the rest of the country. Now, crucially, conventional gasoline was subject to what the EPA called anti-dumping rules. Now, pay attention here, because in this context, anti-dumping doesn't mean international price dumping. It meant producers couldn't take the dirty, polluting elements they stripped out of the reformulated gasoline and simply dump them into the conventional gasoline supply. Basically, conventional gas could be no dirtier than the gas sold back in 1990.
Section 2. The core issue. Domestic versus imported baselines.
So the crucial point here, and the real spark of the legal friction, is exactly how the EPA required different entities to calculate those 1990 baselines. To prove that gas wasn't getting dirtier than it was in 1990, the EPA had to establish a benchmark, right? A baseline representing that 1990 quality. Here is where the discrimination comes in. For domestic refiners who were in operation for at least 6 months in 1990, the EPA allowed them to establish an individual baseline. They got 3 bites at the apple. If they had actual 1990 quality and volume data, they used Method 1. If not, they could use Method 2, which relied on 1990 blend stock data. If that failed, Method 3 allowed them to use post-1990 data model to reflect 1990. But for foreign importers and domestic blenders, the rules were vastly different. They were assigned a statutory baseline, which is just a blanket U.S. average, unless they had perfect Method 1 data. And the kicker? The EPA openly admitted it was practically impossible for importers to have that exact Method 1 data. Furthermore, importers were outright banned from using the flexible methods 2 and 3. This stark contrast is the absolute core of the baseline problem.
Section 3. Article 3. National treatment. The rule and application of Article 3.4.
Now we apply the rule. Let's analyze exactly how Venezuela and Brazil argued this baseline discrepancy completely violated GATT Article 3.4. Article 3 is the beating heart of non-discrimination in international trade. It dictates that imported products must be treated no less favorably than like domestic products. If you were writing an essay on this for your exam, you must hit these 3 exact steps sequentially to prove an Article 3.4 violation. Step 1. Is there a law or regulation affecting internal sale? Step 2. Are the domestic and imported goods like products? And Step 3. Is the imported product accorded less favorable treatment? The panel and all the parties immediately agreed on Step 1. The EPA's gasoline rule was absolutely a regulation affecting the internal sale of an imported product. So, the real battleground was fought over Steps 2 and 3.
Let's look at Step 2, like products. The panel easily determined this by declaring chemically identical gasoline to be like products based on the Vienna Convention's ordinary meaning doctrine. Article 31 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties states, "A treaty shall be interpreted in good faith based on its ordinary meaning." Since domestic and imported gasoline are chemically identical, perfectly substitutable, and share exactly the same physical characteristics, they are undeniably 100% like products.
Now, to officially legally define like products, the panel leaned heavily on two major precedents, and you should absolutely cite these in your exam. First, the 1970 Border Tax Adjustments Working Party, which established that like products should be evaluated on a case-by-case basis based on properties, end uses, and consumer habits. Second, the 1987 Japan Alcohol Panel, which reinforced this by looking at uniform tariff classifications. By applying these exact precedents, the WTO panel found that the origin of the gasoline, whether it's pumped in Texas or Caracas, doesn't change its fundamental nature. It is the exact same product.
Moving to the third step, less favorable treatment. The panel ruled the treatment was indeed less favorable because the rules systematically denied imported gasoline effective equality of opportunity. Consider this exact scenario detailed by the panel because it perfectly illustrates the problem. Imagine a domestic refiner and a foreign importer both sell a batch of chemically identical gasoline. The domestic refiner easily passes the EPA check because the batch meets their specific, super-flexible individual 1990 baseline. But the importer? They fail. They fail because that exact same batch doesn't meet the stricter statutory average. To stay compliant, the importer is forced to heavily discount their price, or they have to scramble to import exceptionally clean gasoline just to offset the difference and average it out. The proof was in the numbers. By August 1995, 97% of U.S. domestic refiners were enjoying individual baselines, completely bypassing the statutory baseline that was being aggressively forced onto foreign importers.
Naturally, the U.S. tried to defend this discrimination, and they used two distinct arguments. But the panel swiftly dismantled both of them, citing two more crucial precedents you need to know: malt beverages and Section 337. First, the U.S. argued that importers weren't actually discriminated against because they were treated just like similarly situated domestic blenders who also had to use the statutory baseline. The panel rejected this outright. They pointed to the malt beverages case, declaring that Article 3 protects products, not producers. You cannot base less favorable treatment on the characteristics of the data holder or the producer's size. Secondly, the U.S. argued that, hey, on average, imports and domestic gas were treated equally overall. The panel shot this down by citing the Section 337 case. They stated you absolutely cannot balance the discrimination of one specific imported batch against the favorable treatment of a completely different batch. Each individual imported product must receive no less favorable treatment, period.
Section 4. The Article X Exceptions. Analyzing the U.S. defenses under health, compliance, and conservation.
Since the Article 3.4 violation was completely proven, the burden of proof shifted to the U.S. to justify their rule under the strict exceptions of Article 20. As you know, Article 20 allows countries to bypass GATT rules for overriding public policy reasons, like health or the environment, provided they don't act as disguised trade restrictions. The U.S. essentially threw three distinct exceptions at the wall, paragraphs B, D, and G. First up is the Article 20B health exception, which requires the U.S. to satisfy a rigorous three-part legal test. The U.S. argued that air pollution from vehicle emissions presents massive health risks, and the gasoline rule reduces these risks. Venezuela and Brazil completely agreed with this first step. Reducing air pollution certainly falls under protecting human, animal, or plant life. The true legal test, however, came down to the second step, necessity.
To evaluate this, the panel relied on the incredibly famous Thai cigarette case, utilizing its strict definition of necessary to evaluate the EPA's baseline rules. The logic here is simple, but extremely unforgiving. If the U.S. could have achieved its clean air goals using a different method, one that didn't illegally discriminate against imported gasoline, then the discriminatory method they actually chose was not legally necessary.
And on this front, the U.S. completely failed the necessity test. They argued that tracking the origin of imported gas was just administratively impossible and that foreign exporters would game the system. Well, the panel completely dismantled this excuse. They pointed out that the U.S. successfully tracks foreign origin all the time in anti-dumping cases using documentary evidence and third-party verification. It wasn't impossible at all. Furthermore, the panel called out some major hypocrisy regarding the idea of gaming the system. The U.S. domestic rules actually allowed some domestic refiners to produce dirtier gas than they did in 1990 without any volume caps, meaning domestic producers were already legally allowed to game the system. The panel concluded that a reasonably available, less inconsistent alternative existed, simply apply stricter overall requirements equally to both domestic and imported gas, or let the foreign refiners use their own individual baselines. Because this alternative existed, the U.S. measure was not necessary.
Moving on, the U.S. also tried to invoke the Article XXD exception for securing compliance with laws, which triggers this specific three-part test. The U.S. argued that the discriminatory baseline establishment methods were necessary to secure compliance with the broader, non-degradation requirements of the Clean Air Act.
The panel rejected this defense instantly. They ruled that baseline formulas don't secure compliance with anything. They just set the math. They set the numbers. To fall under Article XXD, a measure must act as an actual enforcement tool, like customs enforcement or a law preventing deceptive practices. The baseline establishment rules were merely accounting methods for determining an average. Because they were not an enforcement mechanism, the U.S. failed the very first step of the Article XXD test right out of the gate.
Finally, the U.S. threw a Hail Mary with the Article XXG exception. This exception regards exhaustible natural resources, and it triggers an even tougher four-part test. The U.S. argued that clean air is a natural resource being exhausted by pollutants, and therefore their discriminatory measures were justified to conserve it.
This brought up a really fascinating legal debate. Venezuela argued that air was just a condition, not an actual resource. They contended that Article XXG was historically intended for traditional, tangible exports, things like petroleum or coal, and it shouldn't be expanded to cover the atmospheric condition of renewable air. This raises a huge question about how trade law views the atmosphere itself.
Surprisingly, the panel actually sided with the U.S. on this specific question. They ruled that clean air is indeed an exhaustible natural resource, just like renewable salmon stocks. Citing the 1987 herring and salmon precedent, the panel confirmed that clean air has real economic and social value. It is undeniably natural, and it can absolutely be depleted by pollution. The fact that air is technically renewable does not disqualify it from being exhaustible under the law. So the U.S. actually passed the first step of the XXG test.
However, the victory was incredibly short-lived because the U.S. failed the second prong of the test. The panel ruled that discriminating against foreign gasoline was not primarily aimed at cleaning the air. It was simply trade protectionism. Again, referencing the herring and salmon case, the panel noted that a measure is only related to conservation if it is primarily aimed at it. The panel looked at the actual mechanics of the rule. Treating chemically identical imported gasoline worse than domestic gasoline does absolutely nothing to directly improve U.S. air quality. Think about it. In fact, providing equal, non-discriminatory treatment wouldn't have hindered the U.S.'s conservation goals at all. The U.S. was entirely free to set the environmental bar as high as it wanted to clean the air, provided it applied that standard equally to everyone. Because the discrimination itself served no actual conservation purpose, it utterly failed the Article XG test.
Section 5. Final Verdict and Recommendations. The Dispute Settlement Body's Conclusion.
So after failing to defend the regulation under Article 3.4 and completely striking out on all three Article 20 exceptions, the conclusion of the WTO panel was absolute. The rigid discrimination against foreign gasoline was struck down. The panel made one really important final note that you should remember for your exam. WTO members are completely, 100% free to set their own environmental objectives. The Clean Air Act itself wasn't the problem. The problem was implementing those environmental objectives through measures that blatantly violated the core tenets of the General Agreement regarding the relative treatment of domestic and imported products. You can protect the environment, but you cannot use environmental protection as a shield for discriminatory trade protectionism. This is a massive case that shows exactly where the line is drawn. Good luck studying these details for your exam, and I'll see you in the next explainer.